Good evening. Uh, this is our last session this evening, and tonight we're going to talk about bonus chapters A, C, and D. Bonus chapter A, working within the legal environment. Bonus chapter C, managing risk, and then bonus chapter D, managing personal finances. Now we've been introduced to a number of the topics that we're going to go through this evening, pardon me, earlier in the course. But I think these bonus chapters are very interesting, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time going over them. As you know, or at least I hope you know, there is no requirement for summaries for these bonus chapters. So the work that you're doing to be turned in tonight is the last weekly work, and then your term paper is due next week. These are, pardon me, short chapters, so we will probably spend somewhere in the area of about an hour and a half, probably a little bit less than that. But I think you'll find these to be very interesting chapters, and we'll go over them, and I think that it will be good for you. So what our learning goals are, we're going to define business law, distinguish between statutory and common law, and then explain the role of administrative agencies. Those agencies, by the way, which we are often like to complain about, are given authority by the Congress to act in the Congress's name. We'll look at tort law and explain the role of product liability, pardon me, in tort law, identify the purposes and conditions of patents, copyrights, and trademarks. And we'll also look at warranties on negotiable instruments as are covered in the Uniform Commercial Code, which is used by 49 of the 50 states. Louisiana still uses some tenets of the Napoleonic Code. And we'll also list and describe conditions necessary to make legally enforceable contracts. Then we'll summarize several laws that regulate competition and protect consumers in the United States, explain the role of tax laws in generating income, and notice as a method of discouraging or encouraging certain behaviors among taxpayers. Distinguish among the various types of bankruptcy as outlined by the Bankruptcy Code, and then explain the role of deregulations as a tool to encourage competition. Well, I think one of the questions we always ask ourselves is, why do we need laws? And laws are part of civil society. We live in a civilized society. We still have some societies in the world which are not considered to be civilized, and they live according to different laws than we do, but they do have laws. Now, they may not call them laws, they may call them customs or rituals or something else, but they do have a code that they live by. We live by code and we call them laws, and we like to make sure that we follow them. The laws are interpreted by the judiciary, and I want to use that term, interpreted, as opposed to enforced. The laws are enforced by the police, various types of police departments that we have in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and some of its sister federal organizations and the various police organizations throughout the United States. They're the ones that enforce the law. The courts interpret the law. That is, they say this is what the law says, and therefore if you're in violation of the statute, whatever it happens to be, then you're usually convicted. And we have various courts throughout the United States, local, state, and federal. There are various levels of courts, and we're not going to go into all those various levels of courts, but we'll talk about some of them. If you go to a trial court, now this is somewhat of a misnomer because many people think if you go to trial, we're always talking about criminal and civil law, and that's pretty much the case. There may be some cases where it doesn't fall into that category. That's why I'm using that little escape hatch, if you will. Then we have a thing called appellate courts. Appellate courts are found in some cases, depending upon the state, at a district level or maybe even a county level. Then there are always appellate courts at state levels. Usually states have various different types of appellate courts. The United States have different types of appellate courts. We have the circuit courts. Those are the appellate courts. That means that the cases heard at the federal district courts can be appealed to the circuit court, which is an appellate court. And then, of course, the Supreme Appellate Court is what we call the Supreme Court of the United States. We have different types of law. We have criminal law, and that defines what crimes are, usually established as punishment. We do have, at least at the federal level, prescribed sentences for committing certain crimes. And then criminal law also gets into the prosecution of a people accused of crimes. We have things like grand jury and investigative courts and things of that nature. Civil law is a lot different than criminal law. We're not there talking about things that are what is commonly known as a tort, which means some kind of harm. These are things like divorce courts, personal injury lawsuits, and things of that nature. Now, obviously, personal injury is talking about a harm, but it does not fall into the criminal area of a tort, and that's why it's adjudicated in a civil court. Business law, that talks about the rules and regulations that govern commerce in the United States. And notice it talks about providing a legal framework for the conduct of business. And these are our three laws that we have. We have statutory law. That is law that has been enacted by a legislative body or legislative bodies. At the federal level, it's by the United States Congress, a combination of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. At state level, it's usually a House of Representatives or maybe a House of Legislators. Some places, for instance, in Virginia, it's still called the House of Burgesses, which is a hang-on from back at when we were under rule of England in this country. And then there is one state that has a unicameral legislative body. I believe that's Nebraska. Only has one elected house. Common law is, we hear that a lot, and sometimes we don't hear the law. But that is a body of law that has come down to us to this day based on decisions that previous courts have made. Notice what is said there. It is not written law. Written law goes back to what we call legislative or statutory law that is enacted by a legislative body and then signed into law by the executive, being a governor or the President of the United States. In some cases, it could be mayors that do this, depending upon the jurisdiction and whatever kind of rules that they follow. And then the next thing we have here is precedent. And that is something that has been set by previous justices. And I'm using the term justice as opposed to judge, but it's the same thing. And what this does, as the slide says, it guides today's judges and justices in reaching decisions. But this, again, is not written law. You will not find it codified any place. It is precedent, and we continue to do this over a period of years. This is what I was talking about before, the administrative agencies. There's a number I mentioned here: Federal Reserve Board, Federal Reserve Board, Securities and Exchange Commission, Federal Trade Commission, Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. We should put the IRS in here because these are either, as the slide says, federal or state agencies that are empowered by their legislative bodies to act in their stead. They have the authority to interpret the written law and say what it says. And so they have very wide authority. And when we hear legislators complaining about federal agencies making law or interpreting law, they simply forget what they do. The Congress of the United States or the legislatures of the 50 states don't have enough people working for them to enforce all the laws and regulations that they have on the books. And so there are agencies that are hired to do that. They're set up to do that. They're instituted to do that. And so when a legislator complains about an agency doing something that he or she doesn't think they have the authority to do, they need to stop and read what they have done. And too often they don't do that. Now we're going to talk now about tort law. Tort, as I mentioned before, is a harm. Notice here it says it's a wrongful act that causes injury to someone else. Now, you remember we go back to personal injury, which comes under civil law, and it doesn't rise to the level of being a tort. So, and there's another reason people will go to civil law to try to recover their losses, and that's because in a criminal court, a jury has to reach a verdict beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's not true in a civil case. Juries can convict or acquit, but we're talking about conviction here, based on the preponderance of the evidence. And it does not have as high a threshold as tort law does, where the defendant must be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil law does not rise to that level. You may remember the famous case some years ago. O.J. Simpson was tried for the murder of his ex-wife. He was acquitted of that, but his ex-wife's family sued him in civil court, and he was found guilty. And the reason he was found guilty was because they only had to weigh evidence or weigh their considerations based on the preponderance of the evidence. Did not have to reach a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, an intentional tort, notice here, that's somebody goes out to do something to someone. It's intentional. And so we'll think about things like hit and run accidents and things of that nature. Many times those where someone will go to court and they're convicted of a crime of hit and run. But if the police and the prosecutors can prove that the hit and run was willful, then we're into a different situation. That's where we come here to this negligence. And then we talk about negligence, and that is something that causes unintentional harm or injury, but can still be prosecuted. We have two kinds of product liability. There is the product liability, which holds the business liable for harm that results from shoddy workmanship and things of that nature. Notice it says product design, inadequate warnings, etc. Strict product liability is holding someone accountable without regard to fault. Here it is down here, and it's very important to see this, and I'm going to read it because we need to let this sink into us. A company can be held liable for a defective product even if they did not know of the defect. I can't think of an example I want to give to you right away. It'll probably come to me while we're going through this. But this is something that's entirely different than regular product liability. Now, here are some major liability cases that we have. First is the Ford Pinto case, which I'm going to come back to in a second. 1978. These were bodies that were burned. A young boy was burned, severely burned, rear end collision. Jack in the Box. Now, here is the question where Jack in the Box was held liable for sickening people with hamburger that was infected by E. coli, which is a bacteria. Bacteria we find it's quite prevalent. Now that that bacteria can be can be taken care of if the food is cooked at a high enough temperature. The bacteria will be killed. But Jack in the Box probably did not know that the that the hamburger was tainted with this E. coli bacteria. Whereas Ford Motor Company did know about the problems with the rear end collision of the Pinto. By the way, there's a disclaimer. I owned a Pinto, bought a 1974 Pinto and had it for around 10 or 11 years. My children eventually drove it. And I sold the car when it had over 115,000 miles on it. I did not have any problems. But Ford knew that they could have had a placed a gasket around a gas tank, and it would have precluded this spontaneous rupture and then spontaneous combustion causing fire. As I remember, this little thing they put around a gas tank, this gasket, would have cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $6.25. So Ford did know that, and they did what is commonly known as a cost-benefit analysis. And Ford decided it was cheaper to pay claims than to bring all the cars that they had sold back and retrofit them with this gasket. I'll leave you to decide the ethics of that decision, but that's what did happen. Now, here we have some things that we've talked about before, if you remember, back when we were talking in the marketing area. We have things like patents, copyrights, and trademarks. A patent is issued to a company and they have 20 years of protection. That means that they are more than likely, and I am using a qualifying term here, more than likely not to have a product that will infringe upon, I'm going to use the word territory, but we need to expand territory to think about global here, what they're selling, and infringe not only on their territory, but their proprietary rights, their intellectual rights for 20 years. Now, if they find a product that comes out, it's an exact copy, they can take that company to court, and most likely they will prevail. After 20 years, the patent goes away, and the company no longer has any protection. So in other words, that is up for for grabs for anybody to come up to copy that technology, etc. A copyright is different than a patent, and it does not go away after 20 years. The copyright protects the creator, as it says here on the slide, for various and sundry things that he or she does. Now, if you will look at the publishing industry, a copyright is held for the most part by the author of the printed material. After the author is no longer around, he or she is deceased, that copyright goes to his or her heirs. After a certain period of time, and I can't give you the exact amount of time, then it passes to the publisher. And the copyright usually exists for around 50 years or so. And then after that, it goes to what's known as the public domain. When it goes in the public domain, I'm only talking about publishing here and written work. When it goes into the public domain, then anybody can use that work free of infringement. A trademark is something different than a copyright. By the way, copyrights will eventually expire. It seems to me that there's a 50 years on the copyright. The copyrights can be renewed, but they will eventually expire, because after a period of time, it doesn't make any difference. There's no particular reason to keep the copyright around. A trademark, though, usually will stay with a company. And notice it's a legally protected name. Sometimes it's a symbol, sometimes it's something a little bit different than that. And it identifies a particular seller or manufacturer, if you prefer, with this particular good. Nobody else can use the word Coke. Nobody else can use the word Coca-Cola but the Coca-Cola company. And they have some other ones as well. Kimberly-Clark is the only one who is allowed to use the word Kleenex. 3M is the only one who is allowed to use Scotch brand tape. Other companies sell that and they call it cellophane tape. It's the same stuff, it's just a little bit different. These are the patent leaders in the United States in 2010. Those, all of them are not American companies. Samsung is not an American company, and neither is Canon. Now, this is the thing we're talking about here, and I mentioned earlier, it's called the Uniform Commercial Code. Notice it has 11 articles. It talks about and contains the laws governing various and sundry business issues. It covers sales law, it covers commercial law, and things of that nature. It is a very comprehensive document that most of us don't know anything about. We have two different types of warranty, and people should pay attention to these because it does affect you. You are buying a product and you want to find what type of warranty that it has. There's express and implied. Express is what the manufacturer says. This is what we say, this is what it will do, this is how long the warranty is, and it transfers from the seller to the buyer. Implied warranty is something that is imposed legally upon the seller, because it is saying here, implies that the particular product will perform as advertised. And as advertised in the case here is to the standards of the trade. Another thing we have, and we'll find these in the Uniform Code as well, are things that are called negotiable instruments. Now, a negotiable instrument means that if you take this document and it is signed by both buyer and seller in good faith, it's worth money. If you have a stock certificate that you bought when, most companies don't issue stock certificates anymore, they're held, but it's a negotiable instrument. And if you took it to a broker, the broker would give you what the stock is worth, that share of stock, depending upon what the certificate's worth. Let's say it's worth 10 shares. He would give, or she would give you what that's worth minus his or her brokerage fee. Now, okay, how do we get these things, these negotiable instruments? They must be written. Now, of course, obviously, you could have a printed document and signed by the maker. It has to be payable on demand at a certain time. It is payable to the person that holds it, the bearer, and it contains an unconditional promise to pay a specified amount. Those are the 4 conditions for using negotiable instruments. Then we have a thing called contract law. The first thing that we need to think about in a contract is it is an enforceable agreement between 2 parties that entered into the contract of their own legal and free will. And there's some other things that we're going to go to next. But a contract can simply be something as simple as I agree to pay Joe Blow $50 upon delivery of X merchandise. I write that contract, I sign it, Joe Blow signs it, and when he delivers that merchandise, I'm obligated to pay him $50. It doesn't have to be notarized. It doesn't have to be witnessed by a lawyer. It doesn't have to be witnessed by 2 people or anything else. It's 2 people who can legally enter into a contract. And there's some parameters we're going to talk about here on the next slide. That's a legal contract. Contract law is what specifies the legality. And breach of contract just means one person or one party to the contract. We'll make it more than one person. One party to the contract just says, wait a minute, I've signed this thing, but now I'm going to renounce it. Now, sometimes, pardon me, a contract will have an escape clause. The person can get out of the contract in X number of days or hours or whatever it happens to be. And that's all well and good. When that time expires, then that contract is enforceable. Now, here are the requirements for the contract. First of all, there has to be an offer, and then the person who accepts it has to make a voluntary acceptance. So in other words, if somebody wanted to give you wanted to make a contract with you, and before you had a chance to decide whether you wanted to sign the contract or not, voluntarily accept that offer, that person held a loaded gun to your head and said, sign the contract or else. That is not voluntary. And should you survive whatever would happen after that, the contract would not be enforceable. Both parties give consideration. There's an offer made and it's accepted, and then there's a reciprocal. It's just like when you go to the store. The store offers you a gallon of milk for $2.50. Now, maybe more, maybe less. That doesn't make any difference. And once you give the store clerk $2.50, you and the store have concluded a contract, We don't think about it that way, but that's exactly what happens. $2.50 for the milk. Here's the milk. I'll give you $2.50. You give me the milk. That's an offer, accepted offer. The transaction's made. Boom. The milk belongs to you. No longer belongs to the store. You walk out of the store with the milk. The next thing, and we talked about this before, both parties are legally competent to make the contract. Now, I injected the term legally to say that a person has his or her capacities about them. The reason I did that was because there are times when people are considered to be not mentally competent, and they are judged that way by legal authority, usually a judge or someone else in a civil court will do that. Pardon me. And so as long as that person has not been legally judged to be that way, even though he or she may seem competent most of the time, there is an occasion when they just don't make the right decisions. And somebody has gone to court to try to protect them from entering into this type of contract, any type of contract as far as that goes. So they're legally competent. That's the reason I use the term legal. The contract covers a legal act. All right, let's take this in this scenario. Somebody goes down the street and wants to buy an illegal drug from a drug dealer. That does not cover, does not fall within the legal parameters of a contract because it's an illegal substance. It's contraband. And the contract's in the proper form. Now, that simply means that two people have entered into a contract and signed a document. Again, it doesn't have to be witnessed. As long as all the rest of these parameters are followed, requirements if you prefer, it's a legal contract. The breach contracts, we talked about that a little bit before, but there can be some penalties here. Notice if a contract is breached, the following may be ordered. Somebody may need to deliver specific performance, whatever it happens to be. There could be payment of damages. And sometimes if that goes to court, it's damages and court costs and a few other things. And then, of course, it could be discharge of the obligation. That means that the contract will become null and void. There are some things that were passed into law by the Congress. This is the Clayton Act. It prohibits things like exclusive dealing, tying contracts, and then interlocking directorates. We had other federal antitrust legislation. The Federal Trade Commission was enacted, pardon me, in 1914. And then we had the Wheeler-Lee Amendment of 38, gave the Federal Trade Commission additional authority to prosecute firms for false and misleading acts. And then the Wright-Patman Act, Wright-Patman was the name, was Patman's name, Wright-Patman, but the Robinson-Patman Act prohibits price discrimination, and it applies to both buyers and sellers. Here's some high-profile antitrust cases: the U.S. versus Standard Oil in 1911, the United States versus AT&T, 1982, and in the U.S. versus Microsoft in 2000. Here we're talking about consumerism. This is a social movement that seeks to protect consumers from false and misleading ads and from shoddy product. And it's trying to balance the playing field between the seller and the buyer, so where the buyer has as much right as the seller does. We've had some laws that have come into being since we had the financial meltdown that started in late 2007, 2008. Some would tell you it actually started in 2006. We had the Dodd-Frank Act, which is supposed to reform Wall Street to some extent and have consumer protection. Also created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, excuse me. This is just talking about identity theft and the number of complaints about identity theft. Speaking of business, we have taxes. And this is a way that the federal government and other state and local governments earn money. You can't do a whole lot if you're government other than to tax to be able to perform the responsibilities that you're supposed to do. And so we have income tax, property tax, sales tax, and excise taxes. This is just a gee whiz slide saying what it costs for state taxes per pack of cigarettes in various states. This is a question that's asked, is do the rich pay taxes? According to the IRS statistics in 2011, the top 1% in the United States paid 40% of the total tax. Bankruptcy simply happens when it's a legal protection that is given to businesses and or individuals to help them get over the financial distress that they find themselves in. And the courts have, the business or the individual has to come to court and has to have a plan as to how he or she or the business is going to pay back their debts. We have 3 chapters. Chapter 7 is straight bankruptcy, that usually is individuals. Chapter 11, reorganization, and Chapter 13 is the repayment plan. Now, even with the reorganization, there's usually some type of repayment that's mentioned in that. Chapter 7, this is what happens. Creditors that have security claims, in other words, they have a hold on the claim or they have first rights for whatever reason, secured from property or something else, they receive their collateral or repossess the asset, one of the two. And then unsecured claims, that's not backed by any property, are paid in the order it's shown here. I'm not going to go through that. It's something that is listed in the text. You can read it yourself, and it just gives you some idea of how that goes. This is the chart, which you can see in the text. Let me check the actual page number here for you. You'll find it on page A16, and it goes how assets are divided in bankruptcy. These are companies that are out of business, Circuit City, Borders Bookstore. Now, deregulation, the object of deregulation was to promote competition. And the thought process is that if you promote competition, then that is going to be better for the consumer, and he or she will wind up paying less money. Airline industry, telecommunications, and some public utilities have been deregulated. I don't think there's anybody who will tell you that the consumer has come out ahead with deregulation in the airline industry. The thought process is the weaker companies will go away and the companies that know how to do things will continue. Well, what happens is we get a lot of mergers and we can't say that service either improves or that the cost of the consumer goes down. I'm not telling you that I'm against deregulation, but I think sometimes we really need to stop and think what type of deregulation we want and whether or not it's going to be beneficial to the consumer. And this is just another gee whiz slide. It's hamburger regulations, which you can see in your text on page 818. Well, we have reached almost 5:10. We spent 40 minutes, or we have just reached 5:10. So we are going to take a break now for 5 minutes, and we'll come back and we will talk about uh, risk. So we'll get into bonus chapter C, managing risk. Please come back at 5:15. Thank you. It's 5:15, and we will now move into bonus chapter C, managing risk. This is a rather short chapter, and we will probably cover this fairly quickly. I would like to say at the outset that a lot of what we're going to find here in this chapter talks about small businesses and operating a small business. But this risk, we can take this and extrapolate this across the spectrum to ourselves as individuals and or to any business that we're operating with. And when we have responsibility and authority to make decisions, to make sure that we're doing things to minimize risk and not take risk just for the sake of taking risk. Now, of course, there are many people, those folks are in the Silicon Valley and take risks, and that's the business that they're in. And there are a number of companies that are in the business of taking risks and trying to bring out new products and staying on the cutting edge and things of that nature. Most of this risk is talking about monetary. And of course, the risk of bringing out a new product, most new products never see the light of day. And so that is a risk, and there's a risk of losing money there and losing profit and risking a number of other things. But I think this chapter, even though it's short, does have some very good points to it. And I think that we all learn something going through this next 20 some odd slides. We want to be able to identify environmental changes that have made risk management important. Explain the ways to manage risk. There are four, as mentioned here, and distinguish between what's insurable and what's uninsurable risk. We want to define insurance policies, types of policies, and explain the law of large numbers and the rule of indemnity. And finally, discuss various types of insurance businesses can buy to manage risk. What's enterprise risk management? Well, these goals of ERM, enterprise risk management, is defining the risks in which the organization will operate. That's knowing your environment. And remember that you have a very good way, very good ways, as it may be, to control your internal or operating environment, but you have little control over the external environment. And many times that's what you have to really be concerned about. It's not to say you don't need to pay attention to your internal environment, but you have a better control over that than you do over an external environment. Talks about risk management processes, technologies, and investments that will be required, and then how risk management efforts will be coordinated across the firm. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about being able to coordinate. One of the big things we have to remember here, especially when we're talking about a larger business than a mom and pop shop or even a two-person partnership, is we have to be able to communicate across our artificial boundaries sometimes. And we talked about departments, we talked about different things, organizations, and how they're set up. And so we need to be able to communicate across that so people on the other side of the room, if you will, understand the risk that we have over here and make sure we're assuring that that risk that we're being able to manage here doesn't filter across to those other folks who don't have the capability to manage that risk. So risk tells us that there is a chance that we can either make money or we can lose money. We can either have a loss or have no loss. And it also tells us the amount of the possible loss, or if we get into this risk, how much risk are we looking at? Can we put a number on that? That's what we're talking about, amount. We have two kinds of risk, speculative and pure. Speculative means we can either make a profit or we can take a loss. It may be considered to be 50-50. It's not always, but it may be considered to be that. Pure risk means we're going to lose, no chance to at all to come out ahead. Now, these are ways that we're going to be able to try to, slide says deal with, I'm saying try to, minimize or deal with pure risk. The first is to reduce the risk, but remember here, if we're going to reduce the risk, pure risk says we have no chance to make profit. So if we're going to reduce that risk, all this says to me is that we're just reducing the amount of our loss, but we're still going to lose money. Now, that may be acceptable, and it may not be acceptable, and you have to look at that. So maybe the best thing to do is to go to the next thing, and that's to avoid it. Let's not get into this ball game at all. We'll stay away, and we'll take the high road and not get into this business. We can insure against this risk. Notice the first is self-insurance, so that means we're doing something to ameliorate that risk with our own assets. And finally, buying insurance from an outside carrier, somebody like Metropolitan Life or State Farm Insurance or Allstate or somebody like that, that's in the risk, so we can minimize our loss. Now you have to remember, when you're asking an insurance company to take on that risk, the insurance company is going to come around and do some type of investigation, and they're going to decide whether or not they want to issue you a policy, even though they're going to get paid for it. They're going to get paid some money, but if that risk gets so catastrophic, they're going to wind up holding the bag past after that money, and they're not going to want to do that. These are costly disasters that we've had throughout the world since, well, this goes back a little over 20 years, back to 1991, Hurricane Andrew. But there's a lot of money that is lost. Katrina cost $122 billion. And this does not even get into the huge tsunaami that devastated parts of Japan and harmed other areas in the world. Had the nuclear plant meltdowns after that, et cetera. So I don't know what that cost is, but 122 billion we have here, and it's just a significant amount of money. Well, here's self-insurance. We talked about it before. We're going to take our assets. Now, this talks about setting aside money, but those are our assets. We own those. And we're going to use those as a buffer, if you will, against this risk. So we expect to have some claims. We're going to be able to pay those claims, or at least we claim we're going to be able to pay those claims out of our own assets. So notice we're only going to buy catastrophic insurance to cover big losses. Now, what happens here is when companies do this, they do what's known as going bare. And their money comes out that they're going to pay out comes out of their operating costs. Now that's going to reduce profit. And if it's a publicly traded company, stockholders, shareholders may not want them to do that, and it may cause a lot of problems. On the other hand, they may say, yes, let's go ahead and do that because the cost of outside insurance is going to be more than we want to pay. Well, you can't get insured for everything. Some things you just cannot get insured for. Market instability. This says market risk, but I'm going to use the word instability. Obviously, political risk. Now, what that means is if you, well, at least as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to take this to a different step here. You have invested money in a foreign country somehow, and the next thing you know, and by the way, this has happened many times, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not as peacefully. The government in charge in that country says, "Oh, wait a minute, those resources belong to us, and we're going to nationalize those resources." And anybody that owns stock in that company, it's just tough noogies. We own it. It's ours. Goodbye. See you later. Whatever loss you take, you're going to take. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. Saudi Arabia nationalized its oil. The former president, I would prefer a different word for him, who's deceased now, Hugo Chavez, did that in Venezuela, just automatically said, we're going to do this. That happened in a few other countries around the world. Personal risk, you can't get insurance for that. And then operational risk is the same thing. So you're not going to go to any insurance company and say, this is my risk and here's what it is. And I'm going to tell you, no, we're not going to insure that. We're not going to sell you a policy for that. So there are insurable risks, and insurance companies will provide insurance for some type of risk. So there must be an insurable interest. That's like your automobile or your home or something of that nature. Any loss that you have, has to be calculated. And if they can calculate that, then they're going to what the potential loss is. Then they're going to be able to insure you. If you go back to the previous slide, none of those things can be calculated. And then obviously here's the next step. The chance of loss has to be calculated as well. I'm using the term calculated as opposed to measurable because that's what insurance companies do. They calculate the loss, or they calculate the potential for loss. Yes, it's measured, but they calculate that. There's if you buy life insurance, there's actuarial tables that insurance companies use that say that you are the purchaser and you will live so many years before we have to pay this benefit. And you're paying into that all that period of time. Now, the loss must be accidental. If you decide you want to get some money out of your insurance company, you go out and set fire to your house, that's not accidental. Somebody's probably going to be able to prove that. You're not going to get any money, and you probably wind up going to jail. The insurance company is going to try to disperse that risk. And what I mean by disperse that risk, they're going to try to get other insurance companies to buy into that risk, and so they'll move that risk out. And so they won't be taking on too much of a risk. Other insurance companies will be taking some of the risk as well. And then the insurance company is going to have standards, and they're published. You may not be able to see them, but they are published, and they'll say, these are the risks we're going to accept. We will not accept those risks. And so if you're a person trying to buy insurance from a company and your risk is not very good, let's just say you want to insure your automobile, but you had moving violations for running traffic signals or stop signs, or you may have had a violation for driving under the influence or something else. The insurance company may say to you, no, we're not going to take your risk. Or they may say, yes, we will take your risk, but you're going to pay double the normal policy. So if we normally cover the type of automobile you have for $900 a year, it's going to cost you $1,800. And you can decide whether you want to pay that or not. An insurance policy is a written contract. The contract between the maker, the insurance company, and the buyer. That's you or me. And there's a promise in there to pay for all of the damage, the loss that comes about by the company. Now they may say we're going to pay all of the loss. They say we're only going to pay some of the loss. And it's one of those things that you really need to make sure when you buy a policy, especially a policy, home policy, that you read what is covered and what is not covered. Uh, Many years ago, my dad told me a story about a fellow whose attic got infested by squirrels, and they chewed through some wires and stuff, and the house caught on fire. So this guy thought he was covered, and he found out that the insurance policy said it did not cover damage caused by rodents. A squirrel is a rodent. We don't think about that, but they are. And so that's what I'm saying. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the insurance company's trying to get out of paying something. It simply says, hey, wait a minute, here's a risk here. We're not going to pay for that risk. So you need to make sure that you read your policy carefully. I know those things are difficult to read. So you may want to take it to a lawyer and ask a lawyer. It's going to cost you, yes. But you may want to ask the lawyer to read that and make sure that you're on solid ground. Now, premium, that's what you pay. You pay on a monthly basis or a semi-annual basis or quarterly or yearly, whatever it happens to be. That's the charge for the policy. And a claim is something you file when you have some kind of a loss. Now, this is what insurance companies do. They have what's known as the law of large numbers. They want to sell as many policies as possible, so they reduce the risk that they have in paying out claims. So in other words, they're going to be able to, number one, make more money and pay fewer claims if they insure 100,000 cars as opposed to insuring 10,000 cars. They're reducing their risk, and they're getting more premium money in. So when they do have to pay a claim, there's a lot more coming in than going out on the claim. The rule of indemnity says that the insured person cannot collect more than the actual loss. Two types of insurance companies. Not a whole lot that you should worry about here. One's a stock company, and one's a mutual company. Stock companies is like any publicly traded company. It's owned by stockholders, whereas a mutual company is owned by the policyholders. These are stock companies on the left, Hartford, Metropolitan, Prudential. On the right, you have Mass Mutual, New York Life, and Northwestern Mutual. This is something that we probably will continue to talk about for the next couple of years. That is health insurance and the health insurance industry going through mega changes in the United States due to the Affordable Care Act. I'm not going to get into the merits of the act. We have a lot of people complaining on one side and another side, et cetera. But whether or not the government should be involved is something we can debate for many, 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 many years. The object of the Affordable Care Act is to increase the number of people who are insured. Thereby, if we follow this thing from the previous slides, that should reduce the policy, that should reduce the amount of premium that people pay, and it should also reduce the amount of payout that insurance companies have to pay. That's the way it's supposed to work. We'll just have to wait and see. These are employer health options, health maintenance organization, preferred provider organization, and then health savings account. HMO, full range of options, trying to keep members stay healthy. It's a preventative type thing. Talks about healthy diet, exercise, things of that nature. Frequent, not so much frequent visits, but routine visits and things of that nature. Notice it has a restricted list of doctors. Preferred provider organizations, not very easy for me to say tonight for some reason. They usually have contracts with hospitals and other institutions like that. Members will pay some are part of the bill, but they get to choose the physician. And then a health savings account is something that is set up by your place of employment. You pay into that. It's like a savings account. Notice it's linked to low cost but high deductible, which means you're going to pay a large amount out of your pocket. Now, the one thing about this is that I skipped over the first part on purpose. It's tax deferred, and what that means is that you don't pay tax on that. It comes off the top, and so you don't pay any tax on it. Then there's other types of insurance, disability insurance, that sometimes you can buy that yourself. Many people who are sole proprietors want to buy that because it will at least keep some money coming in while they're not earning money. Disability insurance is often also offered by your employer. And then there are things like workers' compensation, which is a really good thing to have. This is something that's paid by employers. The individual does not pay anything into that. But if he or she is injured on the job, then they're usually taken care of for their health care costs. Here are some things to get out of most out of life insurance. And notice it's promoting a healthy lifestyle. Don't smoke. If you do smoke, stop. Exercise, and maintain a good body weight. One of the most important things is to figure out how much insurance you need. There are a lot of people who will tell you to buy a lot of insurance. I'll get to this in a second. I don't work for an insurance company. I had a good friend of mine who owned his own insurance agency, just retired. And I'm not trying to get him business either. But a lot of people will tell you when you're younger and you have a family to get a maximum amount of insurance, and you can buy what's known as term insurance. And that insurance will only last for a certain period of time. The object there is that the term insurance doesn't cost a lot of money, and it gives a young family maximum amount of coverage for a period of years until they're at their peak earning power. And then they feel like, well, they don't need that insurance, and so they can drop it. Whether you want to follow that or not is immaterial to me. I'm not trying to give advice. I'm just saying that's an option. Make sure that you have a good insurance company that's been around for a while, and they offer good service and can give you the information that you're looking for. Finally, find a good financial planner. Liability insurance is something people in professions want to buy. Also, people in small businesses may want to think about buying liability insurance. Product liability insurance, obviously something else you might want to consider. Before you make any of those decisions, get some good advice. You can talk to your lawyer. You can talk to an insurance agent that you know and you trust. Just get some idea. The last thing you want to do is buy insurance that you don't need. A lot of people just get a lot of insurance and up to the hilt, and they really don't need that. So, don't get more than what you need, but make sure that you do have the insurance that you do need. Home-based businesses, you have to remember here, for the most part, a homeowner's policy will not pay for a home-based business. So that part of your home that you have set aside. So you need to find out whether or not the insurance company is going to pay that. If they don't, you're probably better off paying a little extra money to have that insurance. And finally, our last slide, know what is in your homeowner's policy. I talked about that a little bit before. don't buy more coverage than what you need. Remember that small claims add up. So if you could pay the small claim out of your pocket, you probably don't want to make a claim against the insurance company. And that's going to increase your premium as well. And then finally, know a little bit of history about the home, how old it is, whether it's in a floodplain, whether you have to buy flood insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So know about your risks, do what you can to minimize them. Remember, a lot of this we talked about small businesses, but we need to also stop and think about what is it I can do to minimize risk for myself and for my family. Well, at 5:40, that brings us to the end of bonus chapter C, and we will take a 5-minute break to 5:45, and we will talk about bonus chapter D, managing personal finance. Please come back at 5:45. Thank you. 5:45, and we're now into our last session, bonus chapter D, managing personal finances. We're going to outline the 6 steps for controlling your assets, explain how to build a financial base, including investing in real estate, saving money, always something good to do, and managing credit. Explain how buying the appropriate insurance can protect your financial base, kind of a little carry on from the last session, and then outline a strategy for retiring with enough money to last a lifetime. Notice here that a typical worker, this is very important to think about, especially for those of you pursuing a college degree and thinking about perhaps moving on to a master's degree or even beyond. A typical full-time worker with a 4-year degree earns about $50,000, or 62% more than a person with a high school degree. Now that's across the board. You're going to find some people that have high school degrees that make more money than that, just as well as you're going to find some people with college degrees that might make a little bit less. But notice the lifetime earnings of a person with a bachelor's degree is approximately $1.6 million more than a person with a high school degree. Now, these are the 6 steps to control your finances. First of all, you need to have an inventory of everything you own, all of your assets. Make sure that you know how much you're spending. Now, in spending, as we have to remember, that's your rent or mortgage, that's the amount of money you spend for food, for your utilities, your telephone, computer if you have one, cell phone if you have one. I guess everybody has both of those today. So look at those things, and you need to know how much is coming in versus how much is going out. Have a budget and try to stick to it. Now, I always say try to stick to it instead of stick to it, and I do it for this reason. If you have a budget, you know pretty much how much you have coming in and how much you have going out, and so you have some kind of an idea there. And the reason I say try to stick to it is because there may be a time that you want to buy something, and it's not in your budget, but you think you can handle it. Well, go ahead and do that. And sometimes you need to indulge yourself. Now, what you have to be careful about is overindulging yourself. So you need to do that. And that's why I say try to stick to it, because there are some times that you may find you really need to do this. It's beneficial. And don't feel guilty about it. But by the same token, don't continually overextend yourself, because that won't last. Pay what you owe. Make it as a pay-as-you-go type operation. I owe this amount of money. I need to pay this. Try not to carry bills over. Start a savings plan. If you remember the rule of 72, if you save $1,000 today, a year, and we have a constant interest rate, and remember that it's going to double in 12 years. At the end of 48 years, you'd have $16,000. Now, interest rates are low, but having some money there that gains some money is better than having no money that gains no money. Notice here it says borrow only to buy assets that gain value over time. So one of the things that you have to be careful about here, and most of us do this, is we buy a car, and we tend to buy a car on time or an installment plan. And a car does not appreciate in value over time. Now, yeah, if you get lucky enough when you buy a classic car of some kind, it's going to appreciate. But for the most part, it's not going to appreciate enough in your lifetime that you're going to be able to sell that. And everybody doesn't always know when they have a classic car. This is what's in your normal budget, monthly budget. Some could be a weekly budget. I don't need to go over those things because there's nothing there that you don't already know. Now, here are some things you can think about here. How do I save money? Well, if you go to Starbucks, it says if you buy a latte, it costs you $3. I don't know that that's true, maybe more, maybe less. And you do that every day you work during the month, which is 20 days, you're off on a weekend, that costs you $60. If you go someplace else, you might be able to buy it less than that. So it just gives you some ideas of the differences in value. Remember that you only get what you pay for, but you really have to determine whether the Starbucks latte is much better than somebody else's. And if it's not, you don't need to go to Starbucks. By the way, I'm not putting Starbucks down. I don't drink coffee any longer, but I do frequent Starbucks to get coffee, and they do have scones, which I happen to like very well. Here's how your money grows. I wish we were getting 2% annual rate today. Most of us aren't in a bank, even with quite a good deal of cash on there. It's just not happening. I expect that will change, and I expect that will change sometime either late this year or early next year. May not go up to 2%, but it's going to go up. Ways to cut your budget. Don't buy gourmet unless you have to have it. Cut down your cell phone bill, cut out cable TV. Very difficult for most people to do. I always rail about this. My wife and I have DirecTV or one of those type things, and I say, well, we have 695 channels on it, and everything on television. Just watch what you spend. I think that's the big thing. That's the key here. Don't spend any more than what you can afford. Yeah, you may want to splurge once in a while, but make sure that you do that on an infrequent basis as opposed to a frequent basis. This is just a gee whiz slide. Most of us aren't at that Avenue Billionaires tab, and so we're not going to have to worry too much about whether we want to file that or not. Now, here's the way to build your financial base. If you are married, try to live on, and both of you work, try to live on one salary and invest the other part. First and the largest major purchase that most newlyweds make or younger married make will be a house. Look for a house that you might be able to move into, known as a fixer-upper, that you may be able to do the work on your own and sell it in a few years and make some money. Now, I will tell you that if you're going to buy a house, the rule of thumb is to make sure you're going to stay in a house at least 3 years so you get your investment back. By the way, as it says here, buy for the long term and don't live beyond your means. Now, notice the first rule of frugality. Don't give up something that you love, but by the same token, don't overindulge on that. Find something that you can do that you like just as well that doesn't cost as much money. And it's really as simple as that. It takes a little bit of self-discipline to do this. It's not easy. It's not something that most people like to do, but you can do it as long as you have a plan and you stick to it. Don't have things that are fringe items like I talked about. You don't have to buy this and you have to buy that and you have to buy something else. You remember the Beanie Baby craze? People went out and bought those like nuts some years ago. I don't know if Beanie Babies still are sold to make any money, but people invest a lot of money in that. You have to watch out about crazes. Don't get wrapped up on a craze. Now, this is an interesting thing here. It says never go shopping without knowing what you're going to buy. I like to tell my wife, and I think most men would agree with what I'm going to say, men are buyers and women are shoppers. I go into a store, I have a fairly good idea what I'm going to buy. Now, if you are a shopper and you comparison shop, whether you're going to a department store in a mall or something else, or you're doing it online, that's fine, and do that. And that way you can find bargains and you can find similar merchandise at about the same quality for less money. And that's what. But what you should do if you do that is somehow you ought to save that extra money that you didn't spend. So you're going to spend something. You're going to buy something for $60 and you found it on sale for 50. Save that $10. Don't let that go away. And then obviously shop around for the best deal. Home is an investment you can live in, but do not get caught up in the thought process that property values always increase. Fact of the matter is they don't. Yes, holding a home, buying a home and holding it for the long term, as long as you can make the payments for mortgage and insurance and taxes and everything else, 5, 6, 8, 10 years from now, you're going to get your investment back. But you have to remember something. You're going to have upkeep on your home. And while the upkeep on a home may help increase its resale value is right the first time, you can't expect that you're going to recoup that right away. And some repairs you have to make aren't going to make any difference. So you just have to understand that. It is a good way to help you save. If you can do something like making an extra mortgage payment a year, you reduce the number of years of your mortgage substantially. What you pay in interest is tax deductible. There's a lot of people that don't like that. They say that that's welfare for the middle class. And there's been some attacks on that. Whether or not that'll succeed, I don't know. And then what is important about owning a home is location, location, location. You want to move to a home, buy a home that's in a good school district. Buy a home that's in a good neighborhood. Has access to parks and a few other things. That's all what that location means. This just gives you some idea how much house you can afford, what your income is, what your monthly payment ought to be, what the interest rate is, what you're going to pay, et cetera, et cetera. Now this is talking about saving and managing credit. There's the contrarian approaches, which says to buy stock when everybody else is selling and sell when everybody else is buying. Most of us are not that sophisticated to know when that happens. You would have to pay a lot of attention to the stock market and do a lot of investigation to do that, to come out ahead with that approach. I'm not telling you it's a bad approach. I'm just telling you if you want to adopt that approach, you have to do some research. Watch out for credit cards. It talks about it being used with some. The main thing I want to tell you about a credit card is when you use a credit card, the credit card issuing company is loaning you money. That's not a freebie. They're loaning it to you, and they want their money. They want to be paid on time. If they're not paid on time, it's going to cost you 18% is the least I know, and it's higher. It may go up, and that's 18% on the unpaid balance. Don't get into overusing credit cards. I'm not going to go over this slide, but except to say that only 17% report paying off their balance each month. I can only tell you to do that. If you don't, it's just going to be disaster for you. I believe I used this example. I used to listen to a money program when I was in the Army stationed in the Washington, D.C. area. And the fellow that had the program said, and this goes back in the 1990s, by the way, that if you had $1,000 credit card debt and you only paid the minimum due each month, it would take you 8 to 10 years to pay off that credit card debt. Now, I'm using 8 to 10. I think he said it was actually 10, but I'm going to argue just a little bit there. This is the Credit Card Act of 2009. yeah, the credit card protection, uh, and there's some protections in there for individuals. You can't, if somebody steals your credit card, you're not eligible. You're not liable, excuse me, for more than the first $50, I think, and a few other type things. Uh, just be careful about using credit cards. I know I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's something that it's easy money, and something you can get sucked into if you don't pay attention. This is our credit card debt. It may be even more than that by now. Here's some more credit about paying your bills on time. I don't believe in keeping small balances on multiple cards. I believe in paying what you owe when you owe it. I realize that I might be a little better prepared to be able to do that than some other people, but the advice I give you is do not run up money on a credit card. Don't apply for too many cards at once. Remember that if you have these problems and somebody takes a credit card away from you for non-payment, that affects your credit score. Obviously, don't file for personal bankruptcy. This just gives you credit score ratings. These have changed a little bit. I don't know exactly what the scores are. And I don't know what the changes, but you are entitled to a free credit report each year, and you ought to find a way to sign up to get that. Now, I talked about this first thing is term insurance before. It's protection for a given number of years and costs less the younger you buy it. So if you have a young family and you want some protection for them, term insurance is a way to go, but make sure that you know what you're doing. Whole life insurance, a little bit different. It actually is insurance, and it's also a saving plan. So what you're paying in, you're getting some saving there as well. And in variable life insurance, it's a little bit different. It's a form of the whole life, which we just talked about. It invests the cash value in stocks and other higher yielding securities. You can do an annuity. A lot of people don't have good feelings about annuity. Notice this is a contract that you make regular payments to a person for a life or for a certain period of time. And it guarantees its income until the person is no longer around. Fixed annuity and variable annuity, again, before you get into those things, get some information about them. Make sure you're making a wise and sound investment decision. Disability insurance, we talked about that before. We talked about it when we were in the last chapter of managing risk. Something that you probably want to have if you have a small business, because it will give you some income while you're incapacitated. So think about that and do that. Know about homeowners insurance. We don't need to go back over that. And then an umbrella policy is something that covers everything that you want to be insured: life, automobile, home, things of that nature. Typically, they cost less money, but again, it's something you need to check into and make sure that you do that. This just asks about who pays for health insurance, and this may change, and I'm not going to go into that a whole lot. This is where the money goes, and again, that's not something I'm going to dwell on. Health savings accounts, we talked a little bit about that in the last hour. Find out if your employer offers this. Notice that the plans can be costly because there's usually a high out-of-pocket deductible, but what you pay in is tax-free. Withdrawal to pay your medical bills is tax-free. Notice it says they're not for everyone. You need to make sure that you're the right person and it's the right thing to have. Social Security. Notice what Social Security was originally named. and it's really still known as that. It's the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance Program. It was never intended to be a retirement benefit, which it is become today. We get a lot of talk about Social Security going to be is in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. And there is a debate that we should have amongst the American people and the Congress. We don't want to have that debate. We just want to have one side against the other, continually butting heads. But we do need to have a debate, and the sooner we have the debate, we come to some kind of solution, the better off we're going to be. Obviously, we pay into Social Security if you work and your employer matches that. And then it is expected to run into difficulty sometime in the future. Individual retirement account, there are two kinds of those. And the one I'm going to talk about that's very interesting, we'll talk about last, that's the Roth IRA. A IRA, which you have to set up through your employer. Now, if you're an individual and you own a business, you can have what's known as a Kehoe plan, which is very similar to an IRA. These are tax-deferred securities that you pay into and you pay no tax on until you start taking distributions. And that's exactly what comes down here, tax-deferred contributions. So if you put, IRA, if it comes out of your paycheck, for instance, you don't pay any tax on that. That actually decreases the amount of money you're taxed on. So if you make $1,000 a week and you put $100 into the IRA, your tax is on $900, and then you don't pay on that money tax on that until you take it out. And then you have to start taking that out at age 70 and a half. A Roth IRA does not give you the upfront tax deduction, but when you take the money out, you don't pay taxes on it. This is the individual retirement account, which we talked about here before. And this is a type of individual retirement account, 401k. This is what comes from your employer. And if you're doing it not through your employer, then you have to set it up yourself, and you have to find out if you're eligible to do that. And then if you're working for a nonprofit organization, it's known as a 403B. This is sponsored by the employer. You can set up a certain amount of dollars. Notice it's pre-tax dollars. And then, you're going to continue to hopefully accrue money there and tax-free until withdrawal. One of the things I would caution you is if you get into an employer IRA, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Many times the employer wants you to make the IRA heavy on their stock, and that's all well and good, but that stock is not always going to stay up. Give you the worst case scenario. There was a gentleman who worked for Enron, and he retired from Enron, and he had $1.4 million in his tax portfolio. It was all based on Enron stock. Enron went belly up, and the following day his portfolio was worth $13,000. Diversify. These are the benefits of the 401k. Reduces your earned tax, your earned income, and the tax on that earned income. Tax is deferred until you take the money out, and often the employers will match that up to a certain dollar limit. The Kehoe plan I talked about before, it's for self-employed individuals. They're just like IRAs, they're for entrepreneurs. And notice that they can be withdrawn in lump sum. You really have to find out if you are eligible for a Kehoe or not. And then planning who's going to inherit. Be very careful about this. Talk to an attorney. Get your will updated. get your will, have a will made, then have it updated and keep it current. And then obviously you want to have an executor who will take care of paying all the bills and dispersing the money that is left. Big thing about personal finance is to have a plan and to stick to it. Well, I thank you for your attention. It's 6:10. This is our last session, and I will have this uploaded for you tomorrow. Thank you for your attention, and good night.